Good afternoon and welcome to this session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we will speak with Dr. Richard Overy about his new book, Reign of Ruin, Tokyo, Hiroshima, and the Surrender of Japan, published just a few days ago. And we're delighted to be joined in this conversation and really to launch through their comments our discussion that we hope will involve all of you in the audience, Dr. Dana Barnes and Dr. Ari Hotta. This afternoon seminar, I should say, is co-sponsored by the Albert H. Small Normandy Institute at GW. As always, this is an event co-sponsored by the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program and the American Historical Association. I'm Christian Osterman. I direct the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program, and as for a good number of years now, I've had the pleasure to co-chair the seminar series with George Washington University's Eric Arneson. Today, Eric will introduce our speakers and moderate the discussion. Behind the scenes, the Wilson Center's Peter Bierstecker is producing this event. Thank you, Peter. I want to acknowledge our donors and supporters, and we welcome your support. Details on how to support this effort will be in the Zoom chat function now. I'd like to invite all of you to our next session next Monday at the usual time of 4 p.m. again. We will discuss who will rescue us, the story of Jewish children who fled France and America during the Holocaust. A word on the Q&A for today's session. The session will be recorded and will soon appear on our respective websites. We'd like you in the audience to join us, and there are two ways you can do that. One is by using the raise hand function in Zoom. That's our preferred way because we can bring you in direct conversation with our speakers, our panelists, but you can also use the Q&A function, and then Eric will put your comments or questions to our speakers. With that, let me turn it over to Eric. Eric, Zoom room is all yours.
Thanks so much, Christian. It is my genuine pleasure to introduce our distinguished author this afternoon. Richard Overy was educated at Cassius College, Cambridge, and taught at Queen's College, King's College London, and currently the University of Exeter. He is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, the British Academy, and King's College. He's a regular contributor to television and radio programs, and he can be seen speaking in many a documentary. He is the author or editor of over 30 books, including, and this is only a very small sample, The Origins of the Second World War, 1987, Why the Allies Won, 1995, Russia's War, A History of the Soviet Effort, 1941 to 1945, 1997, The Dictators, Hitler's Germany, Stalin's Russia, 2004, 1939, Countdown to War, 2009, The Bombers and the Bombed, Allied Air War over Europe, 1940 to 1945, 2014, Blood and Ruins, The Last Imperial War, 2021, and Why War, 2024. Again, that's only a sample. Today, he will be speaking on his latest book, Reign of Ruin, Tokyo, Hiroshima, and the Surrender of Japan, published just 2 weeks ago by W.W. Norton. Richard, it is a pleasure to have you with us this afternoon. The Zoom screen, all yours.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me and to give me the opportunity really to discuss what I've presented in the book. I really want to start off by saying why I've written this book. I mean, it is the 80th anniversary, and that was a motive, but I collected a lot of this material more than 10 years ago when I was writing the book on the European Air War. And my editors told me that I couldn't put in the Pacific War because it was already too long. And so it's been on the back burner for the last 10 years. But with the 80th anniversary, I thought it was an opportunity to go back and explore what I couldn't do 10 years ago. Now, I want to start off just by reminding everybody what I'm talking about. I'm talking about um, three air raids, one on Tokyo in March 1945, one on Hiroshima in August 1945, one on Nagasaki, in which 300,000 people were killed in one night of bombing and two nuclear attacks. Um, Now, with the passage of time, killing 300,000, mostly civilians or foreign workers, killing 300,000 people in that brief time seems an extraordinary event, one actually now quite difficult for us to explain. And one of the things I wanted to set out to do in the book was to ask the question, not was it necessary, which is how it's often framed in moral terms, but why was it thought to be necessary at the time? And I think that's important because it will remind us of how quickly um, wartime practices can be radicalized. And we need to understand that, I think, in the context of contemporary conflicts too. Um, Now, if we talk about it being radicalized, why? It's radicalized because at the beginning of the war, or in the late 1930s too, the position of the American Air Force was to plan for precise campaigns against military and military economic targets. And indeed, they thought that that was the only way, in fact, that air power would have anything to contribute. And there was a strong prejudice against the idea of bombing that would damage civilians or the civilian milieu. A view reinforced by Roosevelt himself, who several times in 1939 and 1940 made it clear that in his view this was an inhuman aspect of warfare. 4 years later, the American Air Force uh, undertook a deliberate assault on the most densely populated part of Tokyo and killed 83,000 people in a few hours. Now, there's clearly a huge cognitive gap, really, between these two things. And that was one of the things I wanted to start off explaining before coming on to answer the question, why the atomic bomb? The last part of my book deals really with how the Japanese responded to these two campaigns, the conventional bombing campaign and the atomic bomb campaign. Because the conventional wisdom for decades now is that, terrible though it was, it brought the war to an end. Japan surrendered, and therefore, terrible though it was something which had to be done. Now, I'm going to modify that conclusion, I think, quite considerably when I come on to my comments on Japan. But let's start with the conventional bombing. Why shift from precision bombing to the mass bombing of, well, area bombing, in fact, the area bombing of Japanese industrial cities? And then not just industrial cities, but in fact, a whole list of smaller towns and cities which were hit during the summer of 1945. Well, there are a number of explanations. The explanation by the commander of the 21st Bomber Command, who dropped the bombs, Curtis LeMay, was technical. It was almost impossible over Japan to hit precise targets by day because of the jet stream at 20 or 30,000 feet, which pushed the bombers to incredible speeds, made it impossible for the bomb aimer and the navigator to cope. As a result, of course, the initial precision bombing was very ineffective. And LeMay wanted to find a way of making the Air Force more effective. And he decided to reverse entirely the strategy and tactics pursued up until March 1945. To bomb at night, to bomb from 5,000 feet, to take out all the armament, to load the aircraft with as many incendiary bombs as you could, to send them in one after the other, mirroring Bomber Command strategy against German cities, one after the other, so that they would pile more and more incendiaries on the same place, creating an insupportable conflagration. Now, LeMay claimed that this was something which had to be done technically, otherwise, the Air Force would contribute very little indeed. But that highlights another factor in LeMay's decision, a factor reinforced by the Air Force chief, Henry Hap Arnold, that the Air Force had contributed very little to the Pacific War. The Navy had contributed a lot. The Army under MacArthur had contributed a lot. And the Air Force, if it wanted to have any claim to autonomy, strategic autonomy after the war, would have to show that it could do something decisive in Japan. The decisive thing would be to force Japanese surrender by bombing. Now, Arnold and other senior commanders already pressed LeMay to think about incendiary bombing, and he had done a couple, not very effectively. So that the drift of thinking in the American Air Force was that if the American Air Force was to make a contribution, it would have to hurry up, and it would have to find a way which would catch the public eye. Now, LeMay's attack on Tokyo, the burning out of 16 square miles of Tokyo urban area, did catch the public eye. There was jubilation, in fact, in America, and headlines, saying for the first time, we've got something to show for the Air Force effort. And that was an important factor running right the way through the summer of 1945, that if the Air Force could deliver, then it would be almost certain that they would be able to establish independence after the war. And deliver really meant destroying Japan's capacity to wage war so that Japan would surrender. Now, there are other factors that have often been highlighted. American racism against Japanese. They didn't regard the Japanese as properly human, so if you killed very large numbers of them, it didn't really matter very much. Well, no, that was never a formal directive, obviously. But it is true, of course, and Arnold found this when he was in the Pacific, that there was, among his Air Force commanders, among the pilots, among the soldiers, absolutely no hesitation. It didn't matter how many Japanese you killed. The more you killed, the better, the faster the war would be over. So in a sense, a moral threshold which might have restrained LeMay and Arnold, that you can't really deliberately plan to incinerate the center of cities and kill very large numbers of people, was very quickly scaled down. And in fact, LeMay famously wrote in his memoirs, of course, to think about the morality of what we were doing, nuts. Another factor was war economic, if you like, that the committee that Arnold set up to advise on the bombing of Japan said that the Japanese industry was different from industry in Europe. Japanese industry was scattered out, decentralized in urban areas, in residential areas. It could be in the back room of a house. It could be a little workshop with a few people nestled in a residential street. And therefore, if you burnt the center down, you would also burn a very large number of small industrial manufacturers, which would in turn affect the central organization of aircraft production, whatever. So it wasn't, of course, just killing civilians. It was killing civilians who were working for the war effort and killing civilians who were workers. The more workers you kill, the more Japanese industry would suffer a labor shortage. Exactly the same rationality behind the Bomber Command campaign against German cities. Copied almost word for word from what Bomber Command had been doing 2 or 3 years before. Now, in the middle of this campaign arrived the atomic bombs. Now, I think there are 2 things I want to say about the atomic bombs, and I haven't got room or time to expand on it. 2 things, I think. The first is that it was by no means clear that atomic bombs would be ready in time. In fact, most people in the course of 1944 thought they wouldn't be. There wouldn't be enough fissile material. The engineering of the bombs was incredibly complex. It was not until the end of 44 that they began to see daylight ahead, that it might be possible to have bombs, but certainly not earlier than August, and certainly not for use against Germany. But even then, a great deal could have gone wrong during the course of the next 9 months. The engineering was enormously complex. And that brings me on to the second point, I think, which is so often neglected, I think, in discussing how the atomic bombs arrived in time, which is the effort made by Oppenheimer and the scientists at Los Alamos to get a finished bomb ready and to use it. And I think that we lose sight, in fact, of this kind of scientific hubris, that there was a great deal of kudos attached to the country that produced the first nuclear weapon and used it, showed that it could work. And that was something driving many of the scientists all the way through to July 1945, when the first test was held and proved to be extremely successful. And I think if we just see this as a decision by Truman or a decision by the military leadership, we miss a very important dimension of this development, which is that it required the scientists to set aside any moral scruples they might have had, and they were interested in what an atomic bomb looked like, what an atomic attack looked like, what effect it would have. Indeed, they were planning already to measure blast effects and so on in the aftermath of the bomb once Japan had been forced to surrender. Now, the atomic attacks are almost always separated from the conventional bombing, and I think that's a mistake because the atomic attacks were designed to intensify the conventional bombing campaign. I mean, by August, LeMay had almost finished destroying everything, 60% of Japan's urban area. There were plans after Hiroshima and Nagasaki to bomb a further 7 cities, in other words, to get the Air Force now to conduct a nuclear war up to December and beyond. And I think it's important that we don't separate them out, because if among the Japanese elite, they were not separate either. They didn't say, oh, well, that's conventional bombing, now we've got something different. They tried to understand what atomic bombs were. And for them, it was simply a question of another means to destroy a Japanese city. And at the same time, LeMay was destroying small Japanese cities all the way through the first 2 weeks of August. In some cases, destroying them to a larger percentage than the percentage destroyed in Hiroshima. Now, the decision to drop the bombs was a military decision. It was taken more or less in May, and there was very little deviation from it. Although Truman claims in his memoirs that he had to make the difficult decision, actually the decision had already been made. He had no reason to obstruct the military use of the atomic bomb. The order went out to Carl Spaatz, who was head of the Strategic Air Force in the Pacific, to drop these 2 bombs. He did so, and he prepared to drop more bombs if and when more bombs became available. So it was a military decision, and it was a military decision because the military wanted, or the Air Force rather, wanted to be able to demonstrate using atomic bombs as well. They had something to contribute to the final defeat of Japan, perhaps something decisive to contribute. And indeed, as I've said before, that's the way the history has been written. Now, I've got a few minutes left to deal with the third way I've approached this question. What do the Japanese think of all this? Well, the assumption is that 2 atomic bombs are dropped. They realize what they are, and they put their hands up. But that couldn't be further from the truth. The peace faction among the Japanese political and military elite already began to form in late 1944, and throughout the 9 months from then until the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs, desperate efforts were being made by those who wanted to terminate the war to find a means to do it, to circumvent the hardliners in the army who wanted to fight a final apocalyptic battle in the home islands. Now, the emperor didn't want to do that, and indeed prompted the peace faction around him to speed up ways of finding ways of terminating the war. In the end, by June, July 1945, Hirohito realized that the army was bluffing. There was no way they could actually defend the home islands very effectively, and the defeat on Okinawa confirmed for him that the army was increasingly washed up. When the Allies delivered the Potsdam Declaration, the ultimatum to Japan on the 26th of July, Hirohito thought it was better than he'd expected, and indeed encouraged his political colleagues to hasten efforts to terminate the war and to find a way to terminate the war. They chose completely the wrong way. They thought they could use Russia, who was not at war with them, to mediate between them and the Western Allies. Hirohito realized that big concessions would have to be made, fundamental concessions. But they thought that would be one way to circumvent the army's refusal to embrace the idea of surrender or capitulation. Of course, it was a big mistake. Stalin had already agreed that he would attack Japan 6 months after the defeat of Germany. All the weapons and men were in place in Siberia, and on August the 8th, 2 days after Hiroshima, Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister, informed the Japanese ambassador that Russia was at war with Japan. Now, I've argued in the book, and I know this is an argument that's gone on for years now, but I've argued in the book that it seems clear that what really frightened the Japanese elite was the prospect that Stalin would get there first before the Americans. Now, as we know, there's a long tradition of hostility to communism in Japan. Communist Party had been stamped out in the 1930s. The special police throughout the war had been searching for communists and Marxists everywhere. By 1945, great anxiety that the effect of conventional bombing would be to encourage social protest, indeed perhaps to encourage an end to the war like 1917 in Russia, which is the last thing the Japanese elite wanted. And so they hastened, as soon as the news arrived on the 9th of August, they hastened to convene the cabinet, they hastened to try to reach agreement about the Potsdam Declaration, and they finally asked the emperor to resolve a continued dispute by making a sacred decision, which he did in the early hours of the 10th of August. And it's important to note that he made that decision hours before the official report on Hiroshima actually arrived in Tokyo, before there was any real knowledge that this was an atomic bomb or what it was an atomic bomb was capable of doing. I think that the Russian invasion, combined with fears about social collapse at home, played a very important part in shaping the views of the emperor, the peace faction, and indeed the army leadership over the next few days. Well, we all know the story. There were arguments about the wording and so on, and the emperor, in the end, had to make another sacred decision on August the 14th, in which he said, I want you all to agree with me. We have to terminate the war. And the war was terminated. It was terminated for a variety of reasons: fear of social protest at home, fear of communism, and indeed of the Soviet invasion, the impact of conventional bombing, which had been extraordinary, the growing food crisis in Japan because of the blockade. The atomic bombs played one part in that, but I would argue they were not by any means decisive. And indeed, on August the 14th, when the emperor made his speech to the cabinet and the Supreme War Council, he didn't mention the atomic bombs, but he did mention the continued suffering of his people under the impact, of course, of conventional bombing. In that sense, I think we can see why conventional bombing was carried out on that scale. We can see why the 2 atomic bombs were dropped, but there's, I would argue, a disjuncture between those two things and the Japanese efforts to finally terminate the war. And one final footnote, sorry, I've gone on a bit long. One final footnote, they never, of course, called it surrender or capitulation. These were words that were entirely anathema even to the emperor. Termination of the war was something which was a wording, which indicated that it was the emperor who had made this decision, not that the Allies had forced him to. And that remained the image even after August the 14th, when the Japanese had finally announced to the Americans that they were surrendering. And over the next 2 weeks before the American forces arrived, the Japanese media made great play on this, that in fact it was the emperor's benevolence which had brought the war to an end, not the insistence of the Allies. And that shows, I think, perhaps better than anything else, that we're dealing in some sense with 2 parallel universes. The Americans never really understood that, and had they understood it, they might well have conducted their strategy differently. Thank you very much.
Richard, thank you very much. Our first discussant this afternoon is Eri Hota, an independent scholar who is taught at Oxford and in Tokyo and Jerusalem, and specializes in international relations. She is the author of Japan 1941, Countdown to Infamy, published by Knopf in 2013, and most recently, Suzuki, The Man and His Dream to Teach the Children of the World, published by Harvard University Press's Belknap imprint in 2022, and it was named a Book of the Year by The New Yorker. Overy, welcome to the Washington History Seminar.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure, and congratulations, Richard, on this fantastic book. It was a wonderful, wonderful read. I think there are many things to be admired about this book. For one, it introduces so many perspectives, and yet it is so concise and it is even-handed. But to me, I think personally, the biggest reason why I think it's an important book is that it helps us sort of reorient our thinking about the US bombing of Japan and put it in a larger historical context of violence against cities and civilians. And most importantly, I think the book avoids over-exceptionalizing the most famous bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that's very difficult to do because they were exceptional bombs. And the title and the subtitle of the book should speak to that feeling of sort of historical sequence, reign of ruin, Tokyo, Hiroshima, and the surrender of Japan. And the book is precisely that, which is no mean feat. My personal experience, both in Japan and in the United States, has been that it's always a great struggle to sort of decenter or detach the atomic bombings and talk about them as part of a longer historical process, as Richard does. So once an atom bomb is mentioned, people just tend to stop hearing anything else, whether in the context of how Japan's war ended or of the post-war moral discussion on civilian bombing, both of which cannot be examined, I don't think, only by looking at the atom bombs. I'm not really suggesting that we should minimize the exceptional power of nuclear weapons or the subsequent sort of moral controversy that emerged after, say, radioactivity's horrifying and long-lasting effects came to be known. But I think this new book reminds us that we cannot make a sort of retroactive moral judgment on the use of nuclear weapons as if the people involved back then possess the same amount of knowledge that we have today. So we must remember that by the summer of 1945, the foremost US priority had become one of winning the war with Japan through extensive bombing, be it incendiary or atomic. And so I think Richard touched on this. You formulate this often asked question, was the atomic bombing of Japan necessary? The real question really is, why was it thought to be necessary at that time? And I think that's such an important recurring question throughout the book that is handled extremely well. And that why really presents us with a very sobering and gripping story. And if I were to just highlight one aspect here that gripped me, I think it's this sense of horrifying desensitization to the idea of civilian bombing in general. In the months, years, even decades leading up to the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world had become inured to the idea that civilian deaths were a justifiable part of total warfare. True, the world might have been initially shocked by Guernica in April 1937, but all the powers with varying speed and varying degrees of willingness would adjust themselves eventually to the idea of bombing their enemy's civilians. And that, I think that's an important point. And the justifications for this included, as Richard mentioned, the difficulty of precision bombing. It was also aimed at demoralizing the enemy population and ending the war sooner as a result, even though this was never proven to be true. And Richard also mentioned there might have been other social factors at play, such as a desire for revenge and possibly racism, that were not so clearly articulated, but made the decision to bomb unarmed civilians in their sleep all that much easier in the end. And I think such a set of sort of strategic preferences did not suddenly emerge in the summer of 1945. In this book's case, the fundamental moral question of whether it was okay to bomb civilians in Hiroshima or Nagasaki should be as weighty as the question of whether it was fine to target civilians anywhere, regardless of the kind of weapon. But let's not forget that Japan was not just a passive victim in this. Japan was actually one of the first powers to bomb civilians, even before the Blitz, most notably in Chiang Kai-shek's relocated capital of Chongjin, starting from late 1938. And before Chongjin or Guernica, there were other bombings of civilians by the RAF in Iraq and Italian forces in Libya, for example. And let's not forget either that once the Allied forces, the RAF in particular, got started in Germany, they went all out in Hamburg, Berlin, Dresden, and many other cities. So a series of B-29 fire bombings of Japan, which forms the important part of Richard's book, cannot be understood without reference to those past bombings and certain strategic mindsets, or I'd say the furniture of the mind that they created as a result. So now a little bit about the firebombing itself. I think the timing of the publication of this book is very, very wonderful and interesting. As Richard mentioned, it's the 80th anniversary, and only a week ago, Japan commemorated the anniversary of the Great Firebombing of Tokyo. And the Japanese media covered it fairly extensively, in my mind, because it was a huge anniversary. And there were some harrowing recollections by survivors, and most of whom were very young children back then. But even this big anniversary coverage sort of paled in comparison to the attention given to the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on their anniversaries every year. Or in fact, when the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to Nihon Hidankyo last year. Hidankyo is a group of atom bomb survivors working to abolish nuclear arms. To be clear, I'm not really saying that there should be a competition of which cities suffered most. Still, I think that sheer difficulty in talking about Tokyo or any other Japanese cities that were bombed without their being overshadowed by Hiroshima and Nagasaki is very real. And again, I think Richard does a masterful job navigating that difficulty in general. Another aspect of the atom bomb, of course, is the question whether it expedited the end of the war. And I think Richard mentioned it in his discussion already. But just to sort of generally recap, I think the atomic bombs might have influenced the timing of Japan's decision somewhat, but not all that much, because by the time Japan surrendered on August 15th, 1945, more than 200 Japanese cities of various sizes had been bombed. Okinawa had fallen, and the civilian population was suffering from hunger, starvation, basically from the sea blockade. And of course, there was that fear of an invasion, two-fronted invasion, in fact, one by the United States and one by the Soviet Union. So I think that's a very important point to remember. And I would also like to go back to the question of how the practice of civilian bombing became the sort of accepted strategic norm and sort of turn to my question for Richard. I think chapter 2 of the book recounts how US strategists and leaders gradually adjusted themselves to the idea of bombing civilians over time, even though it was pretty quick. And despite what Curtis LeMay later claimed, it was not just him coming up with this idea. And I appreciated that you suggested that an aerial war is particularly sort of conducive to creating a kind of psychological distance between you and your enemy, because there is that literal distance between those on the ground and the bombers. And this idea of psychological and literal distance, this double distance, working in tandem, I think is a very important one, because I think it goes both ways. The Japanese being targeted on the ground to manage to distance themselves psychologically from the attackers and sort of concentrate on the immediate need to survive. And if they were lucky enough to survive, I think they could start picking up the pieces and get on with their lives. So in other words, there's not much room for self-pity or festering hatred, precisely because the attackers were faceless. And, people on the ground could treat their misfortune as some kind of natural disaster, disastrous rain indeed, and not a man-made condition that could have been averted either by the Americans who made that choice to bomb, or the very Japanese leaders who took their nation to war. So my question to you, Richard, is do you think that sense of great distance, both psychological and physical, on both the US and Japanese sides during the war, worked in favor after the war during the Allied occupation of Japan from 1945 to 1952?
Okay, do you want me to answer that
Yes.
now? Well, you raised a lot of very interesting issues, and I mean, before I come on to answer your question, you talked about how readily other air forces had adopted the bombing of civilians, how very quickly that moral threshold was reduced. I mean, the British example is an interesting one, and I touch on it a bit in the book, because in Britain too, in 1939, 1940, it had been made clear by the government and by the Air Ministry that you could not bomb targets where there was a risk of negligent harm to civilians. You couldn't bomb them at night. You couldn't bomb cities through cloud, because all of this would damage the civilian milieu and not necessarily hit the military target you're looking for. And that lasted about 6 months. And then step by step, excuse me, step by step, the Air Ministry and the RAF decided that that was not very effective. They're not going to get very far if they did that. And anyway, the Germans were bombing them, so it didn't really matter. No moral qualms any longer about bombing cities. And then in 1941, they changed to a wholesale strategy of bombing the residential centre of cities to kill workers and undermine the civilian milieu, on the assumption that somehow or other the German working class might rise up and overthrow the Hitler regime, just as they forced Germany to the armistice in 1918, a delusion. But all kinds of special pleading and rather warped thinking coloured the way in which people could justify what it was that they were doing when it came to bombing civilians. Now, the question about the United States also involves Britain, because I think one of the points I make in the book is that the history of the air war in the Pacific is always an American history. But in fact, up to 1945, the Americans had admired much of the incendiary bombing that Bomber Command had carried out in Germany. They'd assumed that this must also be having an effect, as Bomber Command said. Arnold himself encouraged research on incendiarism. They developed the napalm incendiary bomb, the most effective incendiary bomb of the war. And Arnold from 1944 onwards began to think that the American effort to distance themselves from Bomber Command, never to be involved in area bombing or terror bombing, had been wrong. And in 1944 and 1945, much of the American bombing of German targets was actually through cloud with inaccurate radar navigation. and killed very large numbers of civilians. So in a way, the threshold had already been crossed before you get to the war, the air war in Japan in 1945. And once it was justified as an attack on an area with industry in it, it was much easier. It was a geographical region in which you were going to have an effect on the Japanese war economy, and you don't think about the people that you're killing and the houses you're burning down. You think about it that way. And that's the psychological distance. If the pilots actually thought, I'm dropping bombs and I'm killing women and children, burning them to death, if they spent much time thinking about that, it's quite a demoralizing thing to do. But you don't, because you're briefed and you're told that this is a military industrial target. You're contributing to the war effort by, destroying working class areas, and that's consistent with American strategy. That was literal distance, and I think I make the point in the book. The American army would never have gone into a city, or the British army in Germany, never have gone into a city and slaughtered 83,000 people in cold blood. Of course you're not. I mean, it would have been a massive war crime. Nor would the British army have gone into Hamburg and slaughtered 18,000 people in 4 hours. But from the air, there is a different morality. It's really very curious, and it exists still today when we see the bombing in Ukraine and Gaza. It's somehow or other you are not bound by the same moral constraints that you are when you're fighting on the ground. And I think that's a psychological distance, which is very important for us to understand, because it not only operated in the Second World War, it operates today, and it will go on operating as well. Particularly, with drone technology and new technologies and so on, it's even easier to imagine it's just a machine doing something, and you're not actually killing people on the ground, when in fact you are. And I rather hope that my book will highlight the way in which it's possible to shift the moral goalposts by that kind of psychological distancing. Everything was a military target. Everything was an industrial target. Hiroshima was an industrial target, a military target rather, and Truman had to be reminded of that and emphasize it himself. Military target, which of course it wasn't. I mean, there were military things there, but you drop an atomic bomb on a city, you burn it down and kill thousands of people. Yes, it's a very important question, and one which we need to spend more time trying to explore.
Thank you very much. Before we move on, let me remind those of you in the audience, if you have a question, there are 2 ways of posing it. You can use the raise hand function on Zoom, in which case I call on you and you pose the question in your own voice, or you can use the Q&A function, in which case you write out your question and you get to hear it read by me in my voice. So some people have already queued up. Others, please feel free to do so as well. Our second discussant this afternoon is Dana Barnes, Associate Professor at the College of International Security Affairs at the National Defense University. An historian of 20th century international relations, she specializes in the U.S. and East Asia and focuses on foreign policy, international security, and grand strategy. She earned a PhD in international history at the London School of Economics and has held research and teaching positions at the George Washington University, Stanford, LSE, Tokyo University, and the University of San Francisco, and she served as director for the Center of Modern History at City University of London. She is the author of Architects of Occupation, American Experts and Planning for Post-War Japan, published by Cornell University Press in 2017, and she's currently writing a new global history of the Second World War in Asia. Dana, welcome to the seminar. Screen is yours.
Thank you very much. And like Overy, I'll start by just saying that this was a wonderful book and a pleasure to read. So I'm delighted to have had the opportunity to read it and to share some thoughts. Some of the things that I think are most valuable about the book, it is concise but absorbing. And for a popular audience, it brings a really vivid and clear account of Japanese perspectives on decision-making at the end of the war, which will be new to many people. Am I frozen? I'm all right now? Excellent.
You were for a
Okay,
second, but unfrozen.
Wonderful.
We'll hear you.
Of course. I also really appreciated the contextualization, both of the atomic bombs within the context of a larger bombing campaign against Japan, and then also World War II more broadly, incorporating the use of this sort of technology against civilian populations. And by separating and isolating out the two atomic bombings, I do think we've missed that story in the past. And so I'm glad to see this wonderful account bringing that back in. But to my mind, the single most thing that I enjoyed and appreciated about this book is the humanization. It's so easy, even for those of us who spend a lot of time thinking about these topics, to become inured and to not think about what the words that we use mean and the human experiences that we're reading about or writing about. And so this book is really beautifully written and contains a lot of vivid but short pictures that give you a sense of the human experience, both in terms of deciding to use this kind of weapon, but then also to be a victim experiencing these really awful weapons of war. And so to me, that was really one of the most useful and moving parts of this book. Now, the book itself sets up the question, right, which is why were the atomic bombs thought to be necessary? But I don't think that's quite the question here. And I don't think that's quite the question that the book is answering. Instead, what I see are sort of three connected questions. The first is, why was the atomic bomb or the bombs seen as the best course of action? Not necessarily necessary, but the best of options on the table. And the book itself talks about some of the institutional priorities and political reasons that use of the bomb seemed the most attractive option for some American decision makers, but also thinks about some of the alternatives that were on the board that might have been used in conjunction with or in place of the atomic bomb. Of course, the reality of a ground invasion of Japan, but also Richard, I think, makes a really great point that there could have been a more increased bombing campaign of railways and transport hubs as a way of getting at morale and pushing towards early surrender by making the movement of goods much more difficult in the country, as certainly was already the case. Of course, the issue of blockade is raised, and one that has received a lot of attention elsewhere, but little in this book is the question of unconditional surrender. So I'll be curious in the discussion to hear a bit about why it was that the bomb was seen as the best alternative to those other courses of action. And then, of course, simply a continued conventional bombing campaign, which would have happened in conjunction with those atomic bombs had surrender not come so quickly. Now, tied to why was this seen as the best course of action is that question, why did this use of a new atomic weapon seem conceivable at all, right? How can we imagine engaging in a bombing and an annihilation of civilian population centers? How did we come to the point where that kind of a decision could be taken? And the book really gets into that in a way that I think is interesting and was discussed by Overy just a moment ago, thinking about contextualization, the fact that all of the actors, including Japan, the major powers, had come to normalize this type of targeting of civilian population centers, and with the express purpose of damaging and undermining civilian morale to get at surrender in a total war context. Richard also talks about not only the distance that has come up already, the literal distance between the attacker and the victim with the space of the bombs, but also the abstract language that allowed decision makers to really look away from what they were doing, talking about, rather than cities, military bases, industrial centers, etc., as a way to get around a direct confrontation of what was happening. And of course, not having to physically and visibly see the consequences and outcomes on the ground of that action made such things easier. And I think these are really two very compelling points, right? Both that it had been normalized across the course of the war by the repeated use of aerial bombing of civilian centers, but then also the use of abstract language and distance to make the reality of what was happening seem a bit unreal. At the same time, I wonder too about the question of comparison. The point is made, and it's quite a good one, that the bombings of Dresden and Tokyo were only weeks apart, but one received some moral outcry in the Western press and one did not. And so I wondered why that might be. Is it simply a question of sequence? Was the outcry over Dresden happening and then immediately being followed by Tokyo, meaning that that outcry was a bit worn out, it wasn't news anymore? Or do we think that something else is at play? And specifically there, I wonder how much race and racism has to do with the decisions to carry on with these bombing campaigns in Tokyo. And then the last big question that I see coming up in this book is the question, why was it the best course of action, and did it work? Right? Was it, in fact, the use of atomic bombings that leads to the surrender of Japan? And Richard, your argument here is quite clearly, no, or if so, tangentially amongst many other kinds of things that had pushed Japan towards surrender. Certainly the book convincingly argues that the conventional bombings of cities had a much greater impact and over a larger period of time. And then thinking about, in the case of Japanese decision-making, the very real fear of social breakdown, protests, communism, and a revolution from below that would cause more damage to a coherent nation of Japan under the institution of the emperor than would surrender. And so that question or that argument, it was thought to be the best course of action. It was considered as something conceivable, but that it wasn't as effective as we remember it being. These are the three, I think, really provocative questions and responses that come out of this book.
Thank you. Richard, reflections?
Well, thank you very much. Well, you covered a lot of ground there, but I mean, I think you have located the things I'm trying to say in the book, which make it, rather different from the way in which the subject is usually treated. I mean, it was Henry Stimson, of course, in his famous article in Harper's Magazine in 1947, who said that this was the least appalling choice that they had to drop the atomic bomb. But that, of course, relies on an assumption that the bomb worked. Horrible it was, the bomb worked and Japan surrendered, which, as I've argued, of course, is not quite so clear cut. But it's interesting, I think, because at the time there was strong doubts about whether it would have that effect. Truman himself wasn't certain that it would have that effect. The army leadership, Marshall too, certainly didn't think it would have that effect, and the army was already planning, continuing to plan for the invasion of the home islands in a couple of months' time. And indeed, the Air Force planning about the atomic bombings was based on the assumption that you would need more atomic bombs. They thought 3 on Hiroshima. They thought that there wasn't much more to bomb. 3 on Niigata, and so on and so on. 3 on Kokura. And the bombs were coming on stream through September, October, November, December 1945. So also from the American side, it wasn't certain at all that atomic bombs would have that effect. And there was a popular hope, perhaps, that that might be the result. But as you've seen, in Japan itself, the reality is actually very different, and we need to put the atomic bombs into that domestic Japanese context. So even though it was thought it would save American lives, perhaps. Perhaps it would bring Japan to the surrender table. There were also deep doubts about whether that really would happen. Also because nobody really knew what an atomic bomb would do. And although Oppenheimer and his team had spent a lot of time describing what an atomic bomb would do when it dropped, actually with some accuracy, there was, very little understanding among the military and political leadership of what an atomic bomb really was. But Truman clearly didn't understand what an atomic bomb would do until it had actually been dropped. So you got also on the American side, some hesitation, some doubts, some uncertainties, which is why, as I've argued, of course, in the end, it is the combination of the domestic crisis and the invasion of Manchuria by the Red Army, which hastens the Japanese decision to. And also, we need to, I think, with the I don't want to sidetrack too much. The Soviet question is very important because the Red Army went through the Kwantung Army like a knife through butter, and they were in Korea in no time. And of course, you can see what the Japanese are worried. Stalin too wanted to occupy Hokkaido. He wanted an occupation zone in Tokyo, like Berlin, which Truman was able to reject. But for the Japanese watching this Red Army monolith coming towards them, while the Americans were still, stuck on Okinawa, 2 months away from invasion, it was a terrifying prospect. Now, what was the other question you asked? Oh, yeah, Tokyo and Dresden. No, it's very interesting contrast. Dresden, because up until then, the Air Force, public relations business in America presented the American Air Force in Europe as a precision Air Force, dropping on precise targets, whether it's a marshalling yard or whether it's a chemical works and so on and so on. And they didn't want to be associated at all with what Bomb Command was doing. And the release of the press release from Eisenhower's headquarters, which arrived in America saying that they were actually targeting refugees, did produce a wave of protest and uncertainty in the United States. But with Tokyo, it was different. The hatred against the Japanese, the strong desire to get at the Japanese anyway, was quite different from the way in which Americans thought about Germans. And it's quite significant that the details of the Bataan Death March were only released in 1944. And that again became, like Pearl Harbor, a central point of reference. A people that can be capable of treachery at Pearl Harbor, capable of atrocities like the Bataan Death March. What they deserved anything. And so the willingness of the American public to follow LeMay's campaign, and they did. New York Times in June, a million Japanese dead. Well, you think that might worry some people in America when they read that, but there's very little evidence that there was any protest. So they're treated differently. They treat Germans different from the way they treat the Japanese. I think, has that answered your question? The other thing, we were talking about options. And one option is invasion, another option is bombing transport, which would have brought the food supply in Japan virtually to a halt, with catastrophic consequences, or a continuous nuclear war. Americans by August were prepared to wage nuclear war, the first and only power to do so. And they didn't have to because the Japanese, for a variety of other reasons, finally decided that the war had to be terminated.
Thank you. We are now opening this up to the audience. When I call on you, if you would unmute yourself and pose your question, we have actually a very healthy queue here. So if you could be succinct in posing your question, we'll try to get as many folks in as possible. So the first hand up in the queue is that of Alan Gross. Please unmute. You'll need to unmute yourself. And that doesn't seem to be happening. So I am going to move on to Peter Kuznick.
Can you hear me, Eric?
Yes, I can.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Very interesting discussion. The Joint Intelligence Committee to the Joint Chiefs of Staff reported in April and July, probably other times, that the Soviet invasion was almost certain to convince all Japanese that further resistance was at that point futile, and that would likely uh, lead to the Japanese surrender. And as Truman says, after his July 17th lunch with Stalin, he writes in his diary, Stalin will be in the Jap war by August 15th. Finny Japs when that occurs. So I like the fact that Richard is centering the atomic bomb in terms of the Japanese surrender. But any effort, though, I think, to in any way downplay the effects of the atomic bombing or the difference of the atomic bombing is a mistake. As Truman writes in his memoir in 1955, that when Burns came up and briefed him on April 13th, his first day in office, he says, Burns said to me that this is a weapon great enough to destroy the whole world. Then after he gets the full briefing on April 25th from Stimson and Groves, he again says that Stimson says this might end the world and we should consider not using it even if we have the bomb. He said, and I agreed with him what he said. Then when he gets the full briefing of how powerful the bomb was at Potsdam, he writes in his diary on July 25th, we discovered the most terrible weapon in history. This may be the fire destruction prophesied in the Euphrates Valley era after Noah and his fabulous ark. So I know that Richard has got some good insights about the Japanese perspective, but I think the key for the United States in understanding how to assess this is to see that Truman knew this was not just a bigger, more powerful, more terrible bomb, but that he was beginning a process that could potentially lead to the end of life on the planet, which is what we're dealing with now. And he still went ahead and used it, even though he knew there were other alternatives, even though he knew, as he says on the reference to the July 18th telegram, he calls it the telegram from the Jap emperor asking for peace. So I think it's important to contextualize this in another way also, which makes the decision to use the bomb, in my mind, far more serious and horrific than simply the killing of hundreds of thousands of innocent Japanese civilians. It's the process that he initiated and that we've been living with ever since.
Thank you. Richard?
Well, I mean, I do talk about this in the book. There wasn't time to talk about it in my remarks. But Truman also insisted that it had to be a military target. And he and Stimson in the summer of 1945, when his interim committee and when the Oppenheimer Science Committee had both recommended dropping it on the center of the city, Truman insisted that it was going to be a military target. And he was reassured that it was going to be a military target, even though he had indeed been briefed early on about the potential of a nuclear explosion. And I think this was, I mean, it comes back to what we were talking about, well, what Dana was talking about earlier on, that somehow if you can abstract the effects of the bomb from what actually happens. In other words, it's going to be attacking a military target, only a military target. And Truman writes too, and not women and children. That makes it easier for him well, he doesn't actually formally approve it. And what's curious is that it's really Marshall who sets it up and says, okay, we've got the bomb, now we can use it. And the War Department sends Sparks his authorization. And Truman has actually very little to do with that. But he did want to be assured all the time that it was a military target. So yes, double think. On the one hand, thinking this is a terrible weapon, extraordinary weapon. On the other hand, thinking that perhaps this is going to be the weapon that will bring the war to the end and save American lives.
Thank you. Greg Yost, please unmute.
Yes, thank you so much. What a great talk. I appreciate this so much. I've obviously so much to say and so little time. A few observations. You mentioned that some of the cities in Japan were kept clean from conventional bombing precisely as atomic bomb targets, so that after the war they could see what the actual effect of the atomic bomb was, without any insulation, without any interruption from the conventional bombing. The other thing is that the Trinity test, the office poll before Trinity in July, the Trinity test was about 20 times stronger than the average that the office poll had calculated, such as it was at Los Alamos. So until July, middle of July, they really didn't know how strong it was actually going to be in terms of the pre-July versus post-July calculations. Also, warnings. Many Japanese cities were warned about bombings, conventional bombings, but Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the other A-bomb targets were not. And maybe you can comment on that. Now, question. The second bomb, August 9th, the weather conditions were not good. When Major Sweeney and Boxcar took off, it wasn't exactly clear exactly where they were headed. I think they were originally headed to Kokura, but the weather was bad. Made it to Nagasaki, had to do an emergency landing on Okinawa. The Soviets had already declared war between August 6th and August 9th. Do you think there's anything where the U.S. was trying to send a message to the Soviets and or to the world that imminent Japanese surrender was due to the atomic bombs and not the Soviet intervention? That's my
Yeah, I mean, two things there. Yeah, they did keep a number of cities clear of conventional bombing. Well, not 100% clear, but clear of conventional bombing, because they did indeed want to see what the impact of the bomb was. And I came out to that in my remarks that we need to factor in scientific curiosity and scientific kudos too, because the sense that we are the first people to produce one of these, and we are going to be the first people to use it. And the last chapter of my book actually deals with the period after the Japanese capitulation, in which the British and Americans spent a lot of time in the first months after the end of the war, assessing what impact the atomic bombs had, measuring blast effects, looking at the impact on the people on the ground and so on, calculating what that would mean in terms of dropping a bomb on San Francisco or dropping an atomic bomb on London. So there was continued scientific curiosity and strategic curiosity about what an atomic bomb would do. And I think we shouldn't rule out the fact that the bomb was used, partly in order to be able to demonstrate just what nuclear war represented. Now, the other argument, that was it designed to intimidate the Soviets, is an argument. Well, it's been a popular argument for 40 years. I've never really accepted that. In fact, it seems to me to have had the opposite effect. It speeded up Stalin's desire to impose Soviet interests on East Asia, and he continued to do so with Soviet forces fighting in the Kuril Islands 3 days after the surrender ceremony in Tokyo Bay. So for Stalin, it wasn't the atomic bomb. The atomic bomb rather didn't have that effect on the Soviets. What Stalin worried about was that it might make the Japanese surrender, so he wouldn't get the things he'd been promised. So he speeds up and tries to achieve as much as he can halfway down the Korean Peninsula, Sakhalin, Kuril Islands, and so on, before Japan actually surrenders. Maybe one of the other commentators would like to add on that.
Feel free if you wish.
Dana, do you want to add something on that?
Other than I quite agree that Stalin was very worried that there would be a catastrophic success, that peace would come too soon, and that there wouldn't be enough time to secure Soviet interests were Japan to surrender very quickly. Certainly, those were all quick concerns. And so the use of the atomic bomb certainly does speed up the timeline with which the Soviet Union engages in the area. I agree.
Thank you. John Martin, if you would unmute, pose a question. Go ahead.
Yes, I've just bought your book and I've been starting to read it today, and I think as people have pointed out, it's a wonderful examination of an area that we don't know much about. My father was a taxi driver converted to a aircraft mechanic, and he helped build B-17 bombers in a factory in San Diego. And I noticed in what I've read so far, there seems to have been real problems in getting the bombers into condition to deliver the bombs. And I'm wondering, was this essentially a failure, except for the bombs that were delivered to Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
Well, there was a lot of problem with the B-29, which was put into service before it was actually fit for service. And sadly, hundreds of American airmen died, both in training in mainland America and died on operations with nothing to do with the Japanese Air Force. It was put into production prematurely. It had thousands of modifications necessary during the period in which the campaigns were being carried out. But at one point, the British said, "Wouldn't you like to use a Lancaster bomber to carry the atomic bomb?" And Arnold was absolutely livid. No way, he said, is the British bomber going to carry the American atomic bomb. Of course, a Lancaster didn't actually have the range, so it couldn't have done it anyway. But the B-29, in both the attack on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the two B-29s worked perfectly well. And both operations were carried out faultlessly, but that was not predictable at all. A lot could have gone wrong in both cases, in fact. Sadly, for the population of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, these were two operations which worked very well.
Thank you. Michael Binder, please unmute.
Yes. So the Allies had a lot of German POWs because when defeated in battle, German soldiers surrendered. We had very few Japanese POWs because they tended not to surrender. They fought to the death. So did the different behavior of the armies, the enemy armies in Europe and the Pacific, at all have an effect on the decision to go with atomic bombs instead of maybe going with an invasion?
Well, there was a complete difference between German soldiers and Japanese soldiers. Although German soldiers did indeed, in many cases, fight pretty fanatically, even at the end of the war, when they were facing obvious defeat. But yes, they had the capacity to surrender. Japanese soldiers didn't. It's a horrifying story. But the effect it had was to persuade the American military leadership that an invasion of Japan would be enormously costly, because the Japanese would carry on fighting until they died. And there were still several million Japanese soldiers on the home islands, and that would mean enormous cost for the United States armed forces. So from that point of view, it did contribute to the decision. Well, the decision, first of all, to carry on with the conventional bombing as heavily as possible until Japan gave up, destroyed from end to end, Arnold said. But also to drop the atomic bomb. The Japanese soldiers' willingness to die in battle wasn't always willingness, but your options were narrow. Was represented a culture entirely alien to the culture of European armies. where when you reached a certain point, you gave up. And the British Army, because the Japanese, of course, had thousands of British and Australian POWs because they gave up when the going got rough. Japanese soldiers didn't. And I think for the Allies, it was very hard to get around that psychology, really. Trying to, why was it like that? But if it was like that, well, it would be like that when we invaded the Japanese home islands. You know, the Japanese will defend them fanatically at great cost. Therefore, bombing might be a shortcut.
I am going to take a question here from the Q&A. Michael Masters asks, why do so many U.S. military historians take it as an article of faith that the dropping of atomic bombs ended the war and obviated need for a U.S. invasion? In your book, you cite I would just add this myself, the British, or let's see here, evidence from post-war interviews by the Morale Division found that the firebombing campaign was 3 times as significant as the atomic bombs in inducing the certainty of defeat. So the persistence of the argument that atomic weapons were the central factor here, despite some countervailing evidence, much of which you have assembled and laid out quite clearly. So why the persistence on the part of U.S. military historians?
Well, it's not just U.S. military historians. You find it too in British history books on the edge of the war in the Pacific. I mean, I think it is really because it looks as if 2 + 2 = 4. You drop the 2 atomic bombs. The hope is that this one forced the Japanese to surrender. 4 days after the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima, the emperor makes his first sacred decision, and they communicate it to the American Secretary of State. And so it looks as if that must be why it happened. Another bomb is dropped on the 9th, and a few days later, the emperor makes his final capitulation to the Americans. So yes, 2 + 2 appears to equal 4. In fact, you know, that's in a way a rather lazy history, because in fact you need to look a lot more to be able to see whether that is in fact the effect. You know, whether cause and effect is in fact as it looks. It doesn't actually turn out to be as it looks when you look more closely both at the Japanese reality and indeed at what the Americans were thinking at the same time.
Thank you. David Hollinger poses a question in the Q&A. He says, it is often observed that if the public, the American public, later learned that even a small number of American soldiers were killed while the bomb was available but not used, the political heat would have been impossible for the U.S. government to bear. Do you agree with that assessment? And if so, what significance would you assign to it?
Sorry, I missed the beginning of the question. Sorry.
So David Hollinger asks that it's often observed that if the American public later had learned that even a small number of American soldiers were killed while the bomb was available but not used, the political heat would have been impossible for the government to bear. So how do you assess that assessment? What significance would you assign to it?
Yeah, I mean, the problem, of course, is that it was a secret until it was bombed and until the bomb was dropped. And then, of course, it could be publicized. And yes, I mean, if the American public had known that the bomb was there and ready, and the American soldiers were still dying in large numbers in combat with the Japanese armed forces, yes, there might well have been, widespread protest. There's no doubt that once the public knew about the atomic bombs, they were very pleased because they too thought this would, certainly bring the war to an end, and it would certainly bring the boys home sooner, and it would certainly reduce American casualties. So it doesn't happen, in fact. But had it happened, had the American government said, "Look, we've got this big bomb, we're not going to use it," and American soldiers are dying, yes, the American public would not have been happy. But that wasn't the way around that it happened.
Thank you, John Muller. If you would unmute.
Yes, is it your position that if the atomic bomb had never been invented, the end of the war would have been pretty much the same?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, it's a counterfactual, but yes, I think the end of the war would have been more or less the same. I mean, one of the things I talk about a bit in the book, but not a lot, is the impact of the naval blockade. The naval blockade was crippling for Japan. it reduced entirely overseas supplies of coal, raw materials, and so on, and essential foodstuff. By the end of 1945, the Japanese military calculated that imports would be down to zero, and the Japanese population would have faced serious, well, in fact, do in fact face serious issues of hunger all the way through 1946. And the Soviets were going to invade anyway, and LeMay's bombing was going to continue. And if the atomic bombs had not been dropped, he'd have destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, just as certainly as the atomic bombs. So yes, the Japanese were coming to that point in August where they could not any longer sustain the war effort. In other words, termination of the war, I think, would have come anyway.
Yes, Dana.
I'll also play the counterfactual game. We're so rarely allowed to do that as historians. Why not? To say, indeed, Japan would have surrendered, would have had to, and also we know that there was overwhelming political support from within elite decision-making within Japan to do so. But as you think about, would it all have shook out in quite the same way if that surrender were delayed by a few weeks? That seems reasonable, perhaps a month or two. We then might have seen a much more substantial Soviet presence within the what was then the Japanese Empire. And so then you would have seen a much stronger Soviet stake in the post-war order, and almost certainly something more like a shared occupation or a divided occupation of Japan. And if that were to happen, well, then the history of Japan politically might not look terribly different from the history of Korea in terms of a permanent division between partitioned sides. So it might not have mattered much in the short term in terms of when Japan would surrender or that it would, but the implications of that surrender might be very different indeed.
Thank you. James Yellen, please unmute.
Yes, well, first of all, thank you for an extraordinarily interesting presentation. I have two different questions. One, were Nagasaki and Hiroshima significant military targets? And two, is it true that Admiral Leahy, Admiral Halsey, and perhaps General MacArthur and General Eisenhower opposed the use of the atomic bomb?
Well, the answer to the first question is that they were described as military targets by the intelligence community, the Army intelligence community, when they were sending details to the Air Force about why they were going to bomb them. They were not, particularly significant military targets. Of course, there was a garrison in Hiroshima. Hiroshima and Nagasaki both been used, of course, as staging posts for overseas trade, but that had collapsed by the time that they were bombed. And Nagasaki was not a particularly significant military target. Kokura, the target that was not bombed because it was covered with cloud and industrial haze, was a more serious military target, major arsenal, Japanese arsenal. But even then, the bombing of Kokura would have had the same effect of destroying the city and killing thousands of people. Sorry, the second question, I should have written it down. What was the second question?
James, could you unmute again?
Sorry, I should have written it down.
Go ahead.
5-star U.S. military officers.
Oh, yes, that's right. Yes, sorry, yeah.
Who opposed the use of the atomic.
Yes, no, there was opposition against the use of the atomic bomb, high-ranking opposition. There was also uncertainty among military leadership about, not whether it was moral or not, but whether it would really have anything like the strategic effect that the scientists and others were claiming. And after the war, Eisenhower, of course, famously in the 1950s, distanced himself from the atomic bomb and the use of the atomic bomb. Yes, of course, there were people who understood perhaps better what it really represented. and hesitated to approve or applaud it. Nuclear war, although I've tried to connect it with conventional bombing, and it was certainly seen in that way, in a sense, as a continuum by the Japanese. But of course, dropping atomic bombs does cross a particular threshold, weapons threshold, which is why, of course, they'd never been used again.
Thank you. We have a question.
Up to now, I should say.
Okay. We have a question from Paul Teverow, who asks, you have helped me understand how American military commanders justified mass bombings that targeted civilian populations. Have you found evidence of how members of bomber crews understood and justified what they were doing?
Yes, I mean, it's a good question. It's not something that's been highlighted as much as in the European Air War, where pilots, both of the American and the British Air Forces, left memoirs, were interviewed later on, where we have evidence at the time about how they felt about what it was they were doing, but we have much less for the crews of the B-29. In the end, I think that they relied on two things. First of all, they relied on the intelligence briefing they were given, which is that it would be industrially useful. It would undermine Japanese war effort, and that's what they were hoping to do. And the second thing is that in any bombing operation, bombing is a dangerous activity for those doing it too. But in any bombing operation, what you think about primarily is getting there and getting back. Getting there, identifying the target, dropping the bombs, and getting back. And that's your top priority. And in the bombing war in Europe, that's exactly what the pilots always said, that they felt most concern for their crew, and that their top priority was getting there, doing what they were told they had to do, and then coming back again, and reflecting in more straightforward ethical terms at what it was they were doing was something they didn't do. Perhaps you can understand why too. I mean, how difficult it would be if you suddenly sat down one day and said to yourself, "My God, I'm doing X." You would find it difficult to get on the plane the next day.
Thank you. One of our audience members wrote a question that deals with historiography and asks how your work differs from that of Richard Frank and his book Downfall. We might expand that to Max Hastings or J. Samuel Walker or many of the others who have worked in this historical field in the past. So if you could just talk about where your work fits into that historiographical field.
Well, one of the things I've tried to do is to utilize much of the recent writing, and I mean the last 7, 8, 9 years, on what's happening in Japan. In the past, there was a great deal of reliance on the International Military Tribunal documents, many of which are very unreliable. Much more from the Japanese side is now available in English, and which puts the Japanese reaction to the bombing, to the Soviet invasion, to the atomic bombs, into a more detailed and comprehensible context. Right? And the other thing with Max Hastings and Richard Frank, concentrating on the conventional bombing is not. I think they too are attracted very much to the end story. The two atomic bombs, and focusing on the conventional bombing and its effects, focusing on the development of doctrine, focusing on the technology of the conventional bombing campaign is something I do in this book, which is done less, I think, in much of the other historiography. Also putting it into a context which takes it back to the 1920s and 1930s, when American military planners first began to think about what would happen if we found ourselves at war with Japan. I think that a longer context is quite useful from that point of view. But Richard Frank's book, Downfall, is a very, very good book. And indeed, I've taken some of Richard's arguments and detail in my own book. But I really wanted to focus quite tightly on bombing and what its effects were. because I think the effects of bombing, both kinds, have in a sense been exaggerated, and we need to relativize it, put it into a different context.
I am afraid that I need to draw this discussion to a close. There are many more folks with questions, and I apologize for not being able to get to them. But I will say that Reign of Ruin, recently published, is an eminently readable, serious but readable book that is, shall we say, rather timely. So I would invite folks interested in pursuing this further to pick up a copy and to engage it for yourself. My thanks to Richard, Ari, and Dana for this session, and Christian as well. And I want to invite you folks in the audience back next week on Monday, March 24th at our regular time of 4 p.m. when we return to explore Who Will Rescue Us? The story of Jewish children who fled to France and America during the Holocaust, a soon-to-be published book by Laura Hobson-Foray. Till then, everyone, thank you. Take care. Good night.